For 30 years, my son wanted nothing to do with me. No phone calls, no visits, no Merry Christmas or Happy Birthday. He erased me from his life completely. Then, I became rich. Suddenly, he was my son again. The invitation to Christmas Eve felt less like love and more like a transaction. I went anyway, but I didn't come to play his game. I came to end it. And what I did made the room freeze. The only sound left was his fork dropping onto the plate. Now, before I share what happened next, I'd be grateful if you'd consider giving it a thumbs up. The phone call came on a Tuesday in December, a day so gray and damp it felt like the sky over Queens was a sodden wool blanket. For 30 years, my days had followed a rhythm as predictable as the solemn ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. A mahogany ghost from a life that no longer existed. At 71 years old, my world had shrunk to the four walls of this modest apartment, a place where memories settled like dust on the furniture. I'd wake up, make coffee, read the paper, and watch the city move on without me from my second-story window. It was a quiet life, a numb existence, and I had long made peace with it. The shrill, impatient ring of the landline was a violation. A sound from a forgotten era that sliced through the quiet hum of the refrigerator. My first instinct was to ignore it. No one called this number anymore, not for years. But habit, that relentless current, pulled me from my chair. My knuckles, pale and knotted like old roots, wrapped around the yellowed plastic of the receiver. "Hello?" I said, my voice a dry rasp, thick with disuse. For a long moment, there was only the faint, crackling hiss of an open line, a sound that seemed to hold the weight of unspoken decades. Then, a voice emerged from the static, deeper and rougher than the one etched in my memory, but strained with a tension that was painfully familiar. "Dad," it said. The word was a phantom, a flicker of warmth in the vast, cold emptiness of the years. It landed not as a greeting, but as a carefully chosen key inserted into a lock I thought was rusted shut forever. "Dad, I need to see you." 30 years. 30 years he had denied me that name, denied my very existence. He hadn't called me Dad since the day of his mother's funeral, the day the boy I had raised was hollowed out and replaced by a stranger. I remember his eyes that day, the cold, hard fury in them, as he looked not at his mother's casket, but at me. He was 17 then, a taut bundle of sharp angles and simmering resentment. Now, he was 47, a man whose life I'd only glimpsed in the glossy pages of business magazines my barber left scattered around his shop. Preston, my son, the celebrated entrepreneur, the man who had surgically removed me from his life. My mind, against my will, was pulled back into the icy grip of that day. It returns to me not as a clear memory, but as a series of disconnected sensory shocks. The funereal scent of lilies, so thick and sweet, it was suffocating. The sight of black suits moving like shadows against the frozen, unforgiving ground. The muted, polite sobs of distant relatives. Lillian, my wife, was gone, and in the vacuum of her absence, she had detonated a mine, leaving behind a poison that would contaminate the next 3 decades of my life. I remembered standing by the gravesite, the frigid wind whipping at my coat, watching Preston. He wasn't watching the casket being lowered into the earth. His gaze was fixed on me, a look of such profound loathing it felt like a physical blow. Just before the service, a lawyer had handed him a sealed envelope, a final letter from his mother. I never knew its exact contents, only that the words inside had acted like a venom, transforming the grieving boy I knew into a vessel of pure, cold rage. After reading it, he didn't shed a tear. He simply stared at me until the service was over, then walked away without a word, away from the grave, away from our shared history, away from me. 30 years of absolute, deafening silence followed. Not a birthday card, not a Christmas call, not a single, solitary word. Now, he needed to see me. Of course, I knew precisely why. My quiet, predictable life had been shattered 2 weeks earlier by an event so statistically improbable it felt like a cosmic joke. A sudden, staggering change in my financial circumstances. The news had been local at first, but it had spread like a contagion, a heartwarming tale for the evening news about a quiet widower from Queens. There wasn't a corner of the state, or likely the country, that hadn't heard about my newfound situation. The news would have pierced the stratosphere of his world, a world of stock portfolios, corporate mergers, and Westchester estates. He had seen it. Of that, I had no doubt. The timing of his call wasn't a coincidence. It was a mathematical certainty. He wasn't coming back for me. He was coming for what he surely believed was his inheritance. I rose from my chair and walked to the small table by the window, my joints protesting the movement. A stack of mail and old newspapers sat there, a testament to my uneventful life. On top was a page I had torn from a business journal a few months ago, and, for reasons I couldn't fully articulate then, had kept. It featured a sleek, professional photograph of Preston. He was described as a visionary, a titan of his industry. He was smiling in the photo, a polished, confident smile for the camera, but it was a dead thing. It never reached his eyes. Those were his mother's eyes, beautiful, expressive, and capable of concealing a world of secrets. I held the glossy page between my thumb and forefinger. I looked at the face of the man who had discarded me, the man who had judged and condemned me without a trial. With a slow, deliberate motion, I tore the page in half, the sound of the ripping paper a satisfying snarl in the apartment's oppressive silence. I then tore the halves into quarters, and then into eighths, until the visionary's face was nothing but a pile of meaningless confetti in my hand. My gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, to the last remnant of our life as a family, an old, silver-framed photograph. It showed a younger, happier me, with Lillian by my side, and a 7-year-old Preston perched triumphantly on my shoulders, his small hands tangled in my hair. But the photo was damaged. There had once been a fourth person in the frame, a man who stood next to Lillian, his arm casually resting on the back of her chair. A man we called a friend. His face was gone now, ripped from the picture years ago after a discovery that had fractured the foundation of my world. All that remained of him was a jagged white scar in the photographic paper, a ghost haunting the edges of our fabricated happiness. Preston wanted to meet, and he had chosen the date with a chilling precision. Christmas Eve, the anniversary of his mother's death, the anniversary of the day he was fed the lie that he had mistaken for the truth, the day our family finally and irrevocably broke. I knew this invitation wasn't about reconciliation. It was the opening move in a game I didn't know I was still a player in. But I would play. Oh, I would play. Preston chose the restaurant, a decision that spoke volumes before we ever sat down. It was a place in Midtown Manhattan, encased in soaring walls of glass and steel, with a name I couldn't pronounce. The journey there was a descent into another reality. I took the subway from Queens, the familiar rumble and screech of the train a comfort. But as I emerged into the heart of the city, I felt like a man stepping onto a different planet. The air was colder here, or maybe it just felt that way, sliced thin by the towering buildings and the frantic rush of people with important places to be. The Christmas decorations, which in my neighborhood were a cheerful jumble of colored lights, were here a display of corporate, sterile elegance. They offered no warmth, only a reminder of the wealth that powered this part of the world. My 30-year-old wool coat, a faithful companion through countless winters, suddenly felt heavy and out of place, a relic from a forgotten time. I was a ghost from his past, haunting a world he had built specifically to keep people like me out. The restaurant's interior was an exercise in minimalist severity. There were no tablecloths, just dark, polished wood that reflected the muted lighting like still water. The waiters moved with a silent, choreographed efficiency, their faces impassive. It was a place designed for transactions, not conversations, a stage for the powerful to perform for one another. And there he was, at a secluded table in the back, staring out at the blurred river of headlights on the street below. He looked older than the magazine photos had let on. The sharp, confident lines of the entrepreneur were softened by a visible layer of fatigue. There were faint, dark circles under his eyes, and a tension in his jaw that even the dim lighting couldn't hide. He hadn't seen me yet. He tapped a restless finger on the screen of his phone, his brow furrowed in concentration. On his wrist was a watch so intricate and expensive it looked less like a timepiece and more like a piece of machinery. He was a man cocooned in the trappings of success, yet he looked profoundly alone. Those eyes, his mother's eyes, scanned the room with nervous energy. They were never mine, were they? He stood as I approached, his movements a bit too quick, a bit too eager. He extended a hand, and I took it. His grip was firm, the grip of a man used to closing deals, but his palm was damp and cold. A small, insignificant detail that told me everything I needed to know. We sat, and a chasm of 30 silent years yawned between us across the polished table. A waiter appeared, pouring water into our glasses with the reverence of a priest. Preston ordered a bottle of wine, a French name that meant nothing to me but was clearly intended to impress. He then launched into a monologue, a carefully curated highlight reel of his life. He spoke of market shares and quarterly earnings, of leveraging assets and disrupting industries. He painted a picture of a life of relentless upward momentum, a narrative of triumph he had clearly recited many times before. It was a story with no room for a quiet old man from Queens. I listened, nodding occasionally, my face a neutral mask. I was watching a performance, and my role was to be the captivated audience. He spoke of his house in Westchester, describing its square footage and architectural style with a detached pride, as if reading from a real estate brochure. He mentioned his wife, Celeste, a doctor, her profession another badge of his success. Then his voice took on a new, more somber tone. He told me they had tried for children, but it hadn't been possible. The statement was delivered with a practiced air of regret, a strategic deployment of vulnerability. I realized, he said, his gaze fixed on the wine swirling in his glass. At the end of the day, family is all we have. And I let so much time, so much precious time, go by. It was a line from a movie, a hollow sentiment designed to pluck at the heartstrings of a lonely old man he assumed was desperate for reconciliation. I felt nothing. I saw the move for what it was. A gambit. He was establishing a motive, a noble, emotional reason for his sudden return, one that had nothing to do with my recent good fortune. He picked up his wine glass to take a sip, and I saw it then, a slight but uncontrollable tremor in his hand. The expensive red wine sloshed against the crystal, a tiny, contained storm. He wasn't just nervous, he was terrified. After a long, uncomfortable pause, he finally addressed the elephant that had been sitting at our table for the last hour. The apology, when it came, was a masterpiece of evasion. It was a smooth, polished stone of a speech with no rough edges of genuine remorse for me to hold on to. He was sorry, he said, for his youthful impetuousness. He blamed the overwhelming grief of losing his mother, a tragedy that had sent him adrift. His hand shook again as he said her name. He spoke of foolish pride and the way time just gets away from you. He used a dozen different phrases to dance around the simple, ugly truth. He never once mentioned the real reason for his departure, The hateful words I never said. The betrayal I never committed. He spoke as if our estrangement was a regrettable misunderstanding, a natural consequence of grief, rather than a deliberate, sustained act of cruelty on his part. He was apologizing for a version of the past that he had invented, a safer, more palatable history where he was not the villain. He was testing the waters, trying to see if I would accept this flimsy, sanitized narrative. I let his words hang in the sterile air between us. I thought of the 30 years of holidays I had spent alone, the birthdays that passed without a call, the moments of pride or sorrow I had no one to share with. I thought of the gaping hole his absence had left in my life, a wound that had long ago scarred over, but never truly healed. And I looked at this stranger across the table, this man who was offering a counterfeit apology for a crime he wouldn't even name, and I felt a cold, hard anger crystallize in my chest. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was sorry he needed something from me. He was fishing. He wanted to know what I knew, what I remembered of that day. He wanted to see if the old man sitting across from him was a sentimental fool, softened by age and loneliness, or if I was something else entirely. My silence seemed to unnerve him more than any outburst would have. He shifted in his seat, the fabric of his expensive suit whispering in the quiet room. Finally, after the plates were cleared by a silent waiter, he made his move. The small talk was exhausted, the feigned remorse delivered. It was time for the true purpose of the evening. His posture shifted, leaning forward with an air of manufactured warmth. He invited me to his home for Christmas Eve dinner. The date, of course, was no accident. It was a calculated piece of emotional theater, meant to signify a full circle of healing and forgiveness on the very anniversary of our rupture. "Celeste really, really wants to meet you," he said, the lie so blatant it was almost insulting. He needed to get me onto his territory, into his home, to solidify to this fabricated reconciliation before he could comfortably make his play. He needed to create the illusion of a family restored. I felt a cold, hard knot of certainty form in my gut. I looked at this man who was my son, but not my blood, this stranger wearing a familiar face, and I made a decision. I would step onto his stage. I would play the part he had written for me, at least for now. "I'd like that," I said, my voice carefully neutral, betraying none of the cold fury that was churning inside me. "I'll be there." A wave of visible relief washed over his face. His shoulders, which had been tense and high, relaxed. He thought he had won. He thought the old man was hooked. He smiled, a genuine smile this time, the smile of a predator closing in on its prey. "But," I added, my voice dropping slightly, "I have one condition." His smile faltered. "I'll bring something that belonged to your mother." His face went white. The color drained from his cheeks as if a plug had been pulled. The carefully constructed composure he had maintained all evening dissolved in an instant, replaced by a raw, primal panic. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His trembling hand reached for his wineglass again, the deep red liquid shimmering right at the delicate crystal rim. One tremor, one sharp breath, and it would spill. The morning of Christmas Eve arrived with a cold, biting wind that rattled the window frames of my apartment. While the rest of the city was a frenzy of last-minute shopping and festive preparations, my own ritual was of a much different nature. It was a somber, deliberate affair. After a simple breakfast, I walked to the back of my bedroom closet, a space that smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs. I knelt, my old knees cracking in protest, and pulled aside a loose floorboard that had been my secret for decades. Beneath it was not a hollow space, but the cold gray steel of a small fireproof safe, cemented into the foundation of the building by my father 60 years ago. My fingers, steady despite the tremor of anticipation in my chest, worked the combination lock. The sequence of numbers felt like an incantation, a summoning of ghosts. With a heavy, satisfying clunk, the thick steel door swung open, releasing a breath of cool, stagnant air, the smell of aged paper and preserved secrets. Inside, nestled amongst the deed to my apartment and a few old war bonds, was a large manila envelope, thick and heavy with the weight of its contents. It was the arsenal I had maintained in silence for nearly 3 decades. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted it out. I didn't need to check the contents. I knew them by heart, had revisited them in the darkest hours of countless nights. But today, I took them out, laying each piece on my bed like a general preparing for a final, decisive battle. The first was a lab report from a genetic testing facility, the paper now brittle and the color of weak tea. The date at the top was from 29 years ago. The words were clinical, scientific, but they spelled out a truth that had cleaved my life in 2. The second was a small, neat stack of letters, tied with a faded blue silk ribbon that had once been part of Lillian's sewing kit. The stationery was elegant, cream-colored, and if I held it close, I could still detect the faintest trace of her perfume, a scent that once meant comfort and now smelled only of betrayal. They were love letters, passionate, desperate, and penned in my wife's elegant script. But they were not addressed to me. They were written to a man named Vaughn. I spent a long time with those relics, the tangible proof of my life's great lie. I traced the signature on the lab report, remembering the cold dread that had settled in my stomach the day I received it. I remembered the confirmation of a suspicion that had been a vague, shapeless fear in the back of my mind. I handled the letters, careful not to tear the fragile paper. I didn't read them. I didn't need to. I had memorized the damning phrases, the declarations of a love that had been happening in the shadows of my own home. For 30 years, I had kept this poison locked away. I had done it to protect the boy, the innocent child caught in the wreckage of his parents' lives. I had raised him, loved him, and buried the truth so deep I sometimes managed to forget it myself. But now the boy was a man, and that man was coming not for love or for reconciliation, but for money. He was coming to collect on an inheritance he felt he was owed, an inheritance built on a foundation of lies. The time for protection was over. It was time for reckoning. I carefully placed the documents, along with one other item, into the inner pocket of my coat, zipped it up, and went to meet my son. The drive from Queens to Westchester was like traveling between countries, or perhaps between centuries. I left behind the familiar, gritty landscape of my borough, the brick apartment buildings, the bustling delis, the elevated train tracks casting long, skeletal shadows on the streets below. As I drove north, the city's dense, chaotic energy gradually gave way to a serene, almost unnatural order. The roads became wider, the trees taller, the houses set further and further back from the street, shrouded in a cloak of wealth and privacy. Preston's house wasn't just a house. It was a fortress of modern architecture, a sprawling, intimidating structure of dark wood, glass, and stone. It seemed to have been carved out of the hillside rather than built upon it. It glowed with a cold, impersonal light against the darkening winter sky, more like a corporate headquarters than a family home. I parked my old sedan at the end of a long, heated driveway, feeling like a dinghy pulling up to a battleship. As I walked towards the massive front door, I could see the towering Christmas tree inside, its perfectly placed ornaments shimmering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The door was opened by a woman I presumed was Celeste, Preston's wife. She was tall and slender, dressed in a simple but obviously expensive cashmere dress. Her smile was bright and immediate, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. There was a nervous energy about her, a subtle tension in the way she held her shoulders. "You must be his father," she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful. "It's so wonderful to finally meet you. Preston has been so excited." The lie was so transparent it was almost pitiable. She glanced over her shoulder, a quick, almost imperceptible look back into the house, as if seeking a cue or an approval from someone I couldn't see. She was performing, just as Preston had been. She was playing her part in the evening's charade. "Please, come in out of the cold." I stepped inside, and the warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the frigid air outside. But it was a sterile warmth, the dry, conditioned air of a hotel lobby, not the comforting heat of a home. She led me through a cavernous foyer with a soaring ceiling and a floor of polished marble that reflected our images like a dark, distorted mirror. The house was decorated for the holidays with a professional, almost surgical precision. Garlands of fresh pine were draped over every available surface. White lights were woven through them with mathematical perfection, and tastefully arranged bouquets of poinsettias provided splashes of deep, rich red. It was stunning, like a photograph from a luxury lifestyle magazine. But, as Celeste gave me the obligatory tour of the ground floor, the formal living room, the state-of-the-art kitchen, the dining room with its impossibly long table, I noticed something strange. In all these grand, echoing rooms, filled with expensive art and designer furniture, there was not a single personal touch. More specifically, there were no family photos. Not a single silver frame on a mantelpiece, not a casual snapshot on a side table, not even a professionally posed portrait on the wall. It was a house devoid of history, a beautiful, empty stage waiting for a play to begin. Dinner was a tense, carefully orchestrated affair. We sat at one end of the massive dining table, the three of us separated by an expanse of polished wood that felt like a continent. The food was exquisite, prepared by a private chef, I was sure, and served on plates that looked like they belonged in a museum. But the conversation was stilted, painful. Preston did most of the talking, keeping the topics safely in his world of finance and technology. He talked about emerging markets and quarterly growth projections, using a jargon-filled language that was clearly meant to impress, and perhaps to intimidate. He was performing the role of the successful son, showcasing his wealth and power to the simple old man from Queens. Celeste tried to bridge the gap, asking me polite, generic questions about my life, about the neighborhood, about how I spent my days. I gave her short, simple answers, refusing to give them any more material for their play. My silence seemed to make Preston increasingly agitated. He wanted something, and the small talk was just a tedious prelude. He began to circle the real topic, his words chosen with a lawyer's precision. He talked about estate planning, about the complexities of managing a large, sudden influx of capital. He mentioned advisors and wealth managers, painting a picture of a financial world too complex for a layman to navigate alone. He was offering his help, his expertise, cloaking his greed in the guise of filial concern. So that's what this is about. He didn't just want the money. He wanted to control it, to absorb it into his own vast portfolio. He saw me not as his father, but as an unexpected and slightly inconvenient business opportunity. Celeste, in her nervous attempt to be a supportive wife, stumbled directly into his trap. "It's true," she chimed in, smiling brightly. "Preston has been so worried. He said you might need some help managing, well, with everything that's happened." She trailed off as she saw the look on my face, a flicker of confusion in her eyes as she realized she had said something wrong. She had, in her innocence, revealed the entire script. The rest of the meal passed in a thick, uncomfortable silence. When the dessert plates were cleared, I knew the time had come. I reached into my coat, which was draped over the back of my chair, and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound book. I placed it on the table with a soft, definitive thud that seemed to echo in the silent room. "I brought this," I said, my voice calm and even. "I thought you might like to see it." It was our old family album, the one Lillian had kept so meticulously for years. Preston stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. His face, which had been animated with his financial lectures, was now a tight, pale mask. I opened the book, its old pages whispering as they turned. I flipped past the early pictures, the black and white photos of my own childhood, until I reached the years of our marriage. There were pictures of our wedding, of our first apartment, of Preston as a baby, his toothless grin beaming at the camera. He looked at a picture of himself at 7, on my shoulders, and for a fleeting instant, his hard expression softened before he caught himself and looked away. I turned another page, and there he was, a handsome, smiling man with dark hair and confident eyes, his arm draped casually around Lillian's shoulders. He appeared in several photos on that page and the next, always close to my wife, always a part of our happy family scenes, a picnic in the park, a birthday party, a day at the beach. Preston's carefully constructed composure shattered. He stared at the image, a flicker of horrified recognition in his eyes. He knew exactly who that man was. "Who is this man, Dad?" he asked, his voice a strained, tight whisper. I feigned a casual, nostalgic air. "Oh, that's Vaughn," I said. "An old friend of your mother's. They were very close." Before I could continue, Celeste, trying to break the tension, spoke up. "That's a familiar name," she said lightly. "Preston mentioned you were dealing with an estate for a man named Vaughn. Is that him?" She pointed a slender finger at the photo, her nail a perfect glossy red. The finger hovered over the name, and the air in the room seemed to thicken, to grow heavy and cold. Celeste's innocent question dropped into the silence of the cavernous dining room like a stone into a deep well. The air, already thick with unspoken history, became instantly suffocating. Preston flinched as if he'd been physically struck. He whipped his head around to look at his wife, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fury. The carefully crafted mask of the successful, repentant son dissolved, revealing the raw, panicked man underneath. "What are you talking about?" he snapped, his voice a harsh, grating sound, all pretense of warmth gone. It wasn't a question. It was a desperate denial. Celeste looked utterly bewildered. She recoiled slightly from his sharp tone, her eyes darting between her husband's contorted face and my own calm, neutral expression. She had unknowingly lit a fuse, and now she was trapped at the center of the impending explosion. She had no idea that she was both the audience and a casualty in a drama that had begun long before she was ever a part of it. I decided to answer the question for her. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a folded, cream-colored document. It was a letter from Vaughn's lawyers, received just over 2 weeks ago. I unfolded it with deliberate slowness, the crinkling of the paper a deafening sound in the tense quiet. I didn't hand it to Preston. I placed it on the polished table, in the vast, empty space between us, and slid it toward Celeste. "Vaughn passed away 2 weeks ago," I said, my voice even and measured. "It was quite a surprise to me. It seems he left me a rather substantial sum of money in his will." Preston shot out of his chair, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. He stared at the letter on the table as if it were a bomb. $5 million, I continued, my eyes never leaving my son's face. Celeste gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes scanned the legal document, her confusion slowly being replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. The room was silent for a long moment, the only sound the frantic, ragged rhythm of Preston's breathing. He was trapped. The story he had prepared, the narrative of a son returning to the fold out of a newfound appreciation for family, was in ruins. His carefully laid plans were unraveling thread by thread. Celeste looked up from the will, her face a mask of disbelief. "It says she began, her voice barely a whisper. "It says he left it to you, for raising my son when I couldn't." The words hung in the air, a formal, legal confirmation of a secret that had been buried for a lifetime. Celeste's gaze flickered from the paper to Preston, then to the man in the photograph in the album, and finally to me. The pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place for her, forming a picture far uglier than she could have ever imagined. The blood drained from Preston's face. He looked cornered, like an animal caught in a hunter's trap, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. He had walked in here tonight believing he held all the cards. Now he was realizing he had never even been playing the same game. "You knew?" he finally choked out. The words ripped from his throat. He wasn't looking at me, but at the photograph of his mother and Vaughn, their smiling faces mocking him from the past. "All this time, you knew." I remained seated, a pillar of calm in the storm of his unraveling. I took a slow sip of my water, the clink of the glass against my teeth the only sound I made. Let him say it. Let him be the one to speak the ugly truth aloud. Let him admit in front of his wife exactly what he came here for. I met his wild, panicked gaze. "Knew what, Preston?" I asked, my voice soft, but with an edge of cold steel. "Knew that my wife was having an affair with our close family friend? Knew that the boy I had raised as my own, the boy I had loved more than my own life, was not my son?" Celeste let out a small, strangled sob. She looked at her husband, her eyes pleading for him to deny it, to tell her this was all some horrible mistake. But Preston's silence was a confession in itself. He couldn't deny it because he knew it was true. He had always known. He began to pace the length of the dining room, his expensive shoes silent on the thick Persian rug. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up, his movements jerky and uncontrolled. He looked like a stranger in his own home, a man whose gilded cage had suddenly become a prison. "I can't believe this," he muttered, more to himself than to either of us. I can't believe it." But I knew he could. The shock he was performing was not about the revelation of his parentage. He was shocked that I knew. He was shocked that his plan had been exposed before he even had a chance to execute it. He had come here tonight believing he was the keeper of a powerful secret. He had intended to use my ignorance as a weapon, to manipulate my emotions, to play on the sympathies of a lonely old man and walk away with his biological father's fortune. Now, he was the one who was exposed. His greed and deception laid bare for his wife to see. The carefully constructed world of Preston, the successful entrepreneur, was crumbling around him. The foundation of his identity, built on a lie his mother had told him, was cracking. He had spent 30 years hating me for a betrayal I never committed, while the real betrayal had been festering in silence all along. I reached back into my coat pocket. The time for insinuation was over. It was time for cold, hard proof. I pulled out the second document I had brought with me, the lab report from 29 years ago. The paper was old and fragile, its creases as familiar to me as the lines on my own hands. I didn't slide this one across the table. I stood up, walked around to where Preston was standing, and held it out to him. "I've known since you were 2 years old," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "I found one of her letters. I had my suspicions. So I had a test done, a simple blood test." He refused to take the paper from my hand. He stared at it, his eyes fixated on the clinical typed words that officially and irrevocably severed the one bond he thought he had left in this world. "It was definitive," I continued. "There was zero probability that I was your biological father. You weren't mine, Preston. Not by blood." I watched him, waiting for the impact of the words to land. I had imagined this moment for 30 years, played it over and over in my mind. He didn't explode. He seemed to deflate, the anger and panic draining out of him, leaving behind a hollow, defeated shell. He looked down at the paper, then back up at me, his mother's eyes now filled not with hatred, but with a dawning, terrible confusion. "But I loved you," I said, the words coming out as a raw, honest whisper. "You were my son, blood or no blood. So I buried this, I buried it all, and I kept you anyway." The lab report slipped from my fingers, the sound of the thin paper whispering as it scraped against the polished floor, a final damning note in the silence. The confession finally came, not in a rush of remorse, but in a torrent of self-pity and anger. Cornered and exposed, he lashed out, the truth spilling from him like poison. He admitted everything. He told us how he had sought out Vaughn a month ago, after hearing his biological father was terminally ill. "I went for answers," he said, his voice cracking. "About her. Not just for the money." But the denial was weak, a last gasp of a man trying to paint himself in a better light. Vaughn, weakened and filled with a lifetime of regret, had confessed everything. He had told Preston about the affair, about his cowardice, and about the provision in his will, the $5 million left to the man who had raised his son. Preston, in his arrogance, had seen this not as a gesture of gratitude towards me, but as a transaction he could intercept. He had assumed, with the breathtaking hubris of a man who had never been denied anything, that I was still ignorant of the affair. His entire plan was based on that one fatal miscalculation. He admitted that his intention was to reconnect with me, to play the role of the loving, long-lost son, and then, at the opportune moment, to persuade me that the rightful heir to Vaughn's money was him. He was going to use my love for him, a love he had callously discarded 30 years ago as a tool to secure his inheritance. He saw the $5 million as his birthright, and me as a mere obstacle, a sentimental old fool who could be easily manipulated. As he spoke, the full scope of his deception became clear, each word a new layer of betrayal. He hadn't come back for family. He hadn't come back for forgiveness. He had come back for a dead man's money. He had looked at my face in the newspaper, the face of the man who had raised him, and had seen not a father, but a mark. Celeste stood frozen, listening to her husband's confession, her face a pale, horrified mask. The man she had built a life with was revealing himself to be a complete stranger. He finished his tirade, his chest heaving, his face flushed with the ugly heat of his confession. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than before. It was the silence of a tomb, the silence of something that had died. The illusion of their perfect life, of their perfect marriage, had been shattered. All that was left were the sharp, ugly pieces. I looked at my son, this man who had been shaped by a lifetime of lies, his own and his mother's, and I felt not anger, but a vast, empty pity. He was a man adrift, unmoored from any truth, his entire life a carefully constructed fiction. He looked at me then, a desperate, pleading look in his eyes, the look of a drowning man searching for a life raft. But I had nothing left to give him. Not yet. I let the silence stretch, letting him stew in the wreckage he had created. Then I spoke, my voice low and steady, each word a carefully placed stone that would bring the rest of his world crashing down. "But you don't know the real reason your mother lied to you, do you?" I asked. "She didn't tell you I wasn't your father. She told you something much worse." My question hung in the air, a final, poisoned dart. Preston, who had been pacing like a caged animal, froze mid-stride. He stared at me, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning horror. The foundations of his world had been systematically dismantled over the course of one dinner, and now he was realizing there was one more support beam about to be kicked out from under him. He had built his entire adult life on a single, defining moment of perceived betrayal. He had nurtured his hatred for me for 3 decades, treating it as a righteous, noble cause. To learn now that even his hatred was based on a lie was a possibility too monstrous for him to comprehend. He shook his head, a small, jerky movement of denial. "What are you talking about?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "She told me everything in her letter. She told me you weren't my real father. She told me she was sorry for lying to me my whole life." He was clinging to his version of the past, the one that made him the victim. I had to transport myself back to those last terrible days of Lillian's life to explain. The memory was a gray, suffocating fog, thick with the antiseptic smell of the hospital and the quiet, desperate hum of machines keeping death at bay. Lillian had always been a woman of contradictions, charming and manipulative, loving and deeply selfish. In those final weeks, with her body failing, her manipulative tendencies sharpened into a desperate, razor-edged tool for survival. She was terrified of dying, but she was even more terrified of dying alone. And her greatest fear was that Preston, the sun around which her entire universe revolved, would abandon her. She knew he would soon learn the truth about Vaughn. She couldn't stop that. But she could control the narrative. She could poison the well before he ever had a chance to drink from it. So, in her final, desperate act of emotional self-preservation, she devised a lie of breathtaking cruelty, a lie designed not just to keep her son, but to bind him to her memory with chains of righteous anger. She waited until she was weak, until the line between lucidity and morphine-induced haze was blurred. Then she gave her 17-year-old son a letter, a confession penned in a weak, trembling hand. But she didn't confess to her own affair. She confessed to mine. She painted a lurid, detailed picture of my supposed infidelity. She invented a fictional affair with a fictional other woman. And then came a masterstroke of her vicious plan. She told Preston that he was the product of that affair. She told him that I, the man who had raised him, was his biological father, but that he was a child of my betrayal, not a child of our marriage. She made him believe he was the living, breathing evidence of my disloyalty to the sainted, dying woman in the hospital bed. She recast herself as the victim, the long-suffering wife who had lovingly raised another woman's child as her own, all to protect the sanctity of our family. She had made me the villain in her story so that she could die a martyr. Her plan worked with devastating precision. She knew her son. She knew his fierce loyalty, his black and white view of the world. The lie was a poison tailored specifically for him. It didn't just sever his bond with me, it incinerated it. It replaced love with a deep, abiding loathing. He wasn't just abandoning a father he discovered wasn't his by blood. He was righteously turning his back on a monster, a man who had cheated on his dying mother and lied about it for 17 years. He was defending her honor, avenging her betrayal. His 30 years of silence weren't just about pride. They were, in his mind, a moral crusade. He had spent his life hating me not for what I was, but for what his mother had twisted me into. He had built his empire as a monument to his own strength, a fortress to prove that he didn't need a lying, cheating father. And all of it, every last bitter year, was fiction. I didn't have to rely on memory alone to tell this story. Lillian, in her vanity and her desperation, had left behind one final piece of evidence. I reached into my coat one last time and pulled out a small, cloth-bound book. It was her diary, a 5-year journal with a cheap, flimsy lock that I had opened with a paperclip the day after her funeral. Preston recognized it instantly. A flicker of something, fear, nostalgia, I couldn't tell, passed across his face. "I found this in her nightstand," I said, placing it on the table next to the now-forgotten family album. "I thought it would just be..." Memories. But it was something else entirely. I had already marked the relevant page. I opened the diary and turned it to face him. Her elegant, looping script filled the page, but the words were a twisted, frantic scrawl. The ink bled slightly, as if from the pressure of her pen. The entry was dated just 3 days before she died. I didn't read it aloud. I let him read his mother's final confession in the tomb, like silence of his own house. I watched his eyes move across the page, his face growing paler with every word. He was reading the architecture of the lie that had defined his life. "He cannot know about Vaughn," his mother had written. "Not while I'm still here. He will leave me. I know he will. He'll go to that man, and that rich, powerful man, and he'll forget all about me. I can't bear it." The next lines laid out her twisted, desperate plan in chilling detail. "I will tell him his father is the one who cheated. I will tell him he is the proof of the affair. It's a terrible thing to do, I know, but it's the only way. He will hate his father, yes, but he will stay with me. He will protect my memory. He will be mine, always." The diary slipped from Preston's numb fingers, falling shut on the table with a soft, final thud. The sound was like a period at the end of a 30-year-long sentence. The collapse was total. It was not loud or violent. It was a silent, internal implosion. The anger, the arrogance, the carefully constructed facade of the self-made man, it all dissolved, leaving behind the raw, gaping wound of a 17-year-old boy who had been cruelly, unforgivably deceived. His shoulders slumped, his head bowed. He sank into the nearest dining chair, his body moving with the boneless exhaustion of a puppet whose strings had been cut. He stared at the closed diary, but I knew he wasn't seeing it. He was seeing 30 years of wasted, pointless hatred. He was seeing a lifetime of love and connection that had been stolen from him, not by my betrayal, but by his mother's desperate, selfish fear. He was seeing the ghost of a father-son relationship that he had sacrificed on the altar of a lie. The air was thick with the ghosts of 30 Christmases, 30 birthdays, 30 years of moments, big and small, that could never be reclaimed. And then, for the first time since that cold, wind-swept day at the cemetery, another sound broke the silence. It was the sound of Celeste, his wife. She had been standing by the window, a silent observer to her husband's complete and utter unraveling. But her silence was not one of shock or pity. It was the cold, hard silence of judgment. She walked slowly towards the table, her face a mask of cold, controlled fury. The nervous, accommodating woman who had greeted me at the door was gone, replaced by a stranger with eyes like chips of ice. She wasn't looking at me. Her gaze was fixed entirely on her husband, a look of such profound contempt, it was more devastating than any physical blow. The first public reckoning had arrived, and I was merely a spectator. "So, let me get this straight," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, each word a perfectly enunciated shard of glass. "You lied to me. For our entire relationship, you have lied to me about why you didn't speak to your father." Preston looked up at her, his face streaked with the first tears I had seen him shed since he was a child. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some defense, but she cut him off with a sharp, dismissive wave of her hand. "You let me believe he was some kind of monster. You painted him as this heartless man who had cheated on your dying mother. You built this whole tragic backstory for yourself, and you let me pity you. You let me love you based on a complete and utter fabrication." Her voice rose with each sentence, the quiet fury building into a crescendo of righteous indignation. She wasn't just angry about the lie itself. She was angry about being made a fool of, about the years she had spent validating his pain, a pain that was entirely self-inflicted and based on a fiction. She turned her attention to the real reason for the evening's charade, her eyes narrowing. "And tonight," she continued, her voice dripping with scorn. "You didn't come here for forgiveness. You didn't come here to heal some 30-year-old wound. You came here for money. You came here to manipulate this man, the man you've been slandering to me for years, so you could get your hands on a dead stranger's inheritance." She picked up the copy of Vaughn's will from the table, holding it between her thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. This is what tonight was about. Not family, not reconciliation. This. She threw the paper down on the table. It slid across the polished wood and came to rest next to Lillian's diary, the two documents that bookended the story of his life's great deception. The room was now a courtroom, and she was the prosecutor, judge, and jury. With a final contemptuous look at the broken man who was her husband, she made her move. Her movements were calm, deliberate. She reached up and, with a swift, decisive twist, pulled the large diamond ring from her left hand. It was a magnificent, ostentatious thing, a symbol of the wealth and success that Preston had built on his foundation of lies. She didn't throw it at him. She placed it on the table with a soft, metallic click that sounded as final as a gavel. "I'm done," she said, her voice now flat, devoid of all emotion. "I am not going to be a part of this. This sickness, I can't even look at you." She turned and walked out of the dining room without a backward glance, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor of the foyer. A moment later, we heard the sound of the massive front door opening, and then closing with a heavy, definitive thud. She was gone. The performance was over. The audience had left the theater. Preston stared at the ring, its facets catching the light from the chandelier, throwing tiny, cold rainbows onto the dark wood of the table. It was a perfect, beautiful, and now utterly meaningless object. He had spent his life accumulating things like this: expensive watches, a designer house, a successful company, all to fill the void that his self-imposed exile had created. And now, in the space of a single evening, he had discovered that the void was of his own making, and that all the things he had used to fill it were worthless. The tears that had been silently tracking down his face now came in earnest. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with deep, gut-wrenching sobs. It was the sound of a man whose entire world had been pulled out from under him, the sound of 30 years of grief and rage and misplaced hatred finally being released. "I hated you," he choked out between sobs, his words muffled by his hands. "I hated you for nothing. I missed your life. I missed my own life for her lie. But even in his grief, I saw the flicker of his true nature. But you only came back for money," I thought, my voice a cold, hard stone in the silence of my own mind. "You didn't come back for forgiveness. You came back for a payout." I let him cry for a long time. I felt a distant, detached pity for the boy he had been, the boy who had been so cruelly manipulated by a dying, desperate mother. But the man sitting before me, the man who had so coldly and calculatingly planned to defraud me, for that man I felt nothing. He had made his choices. He had chosen greed over family, pride over love, for 30 years. His pain was real, I had no doubt. But it was the pain of a gambler who had lost his final, desperate bet. When his sobs finally subsided into a series of ragged, hitching breaths, I stood up. The evening was not quite over. There was one more piece of the past that needed to be brought into the light. One final truth that would redefine not just his past, but his future. I looked down at the broken man at the table, his face buried in his arms. The flimsy lock on his mother's diary had sprung open when it fell. I reached down and closed it, the soft click of the mechanism, a final, quiet punctuation mark to her deception. Preston lifted his head from his arms, his face a swollen, tear-streaked ruin. He looked at me through red-rimmed eyes, a profound exhaustion in his gaze. He seemed to have aged a decade in the last hour. The polished, confident CEO was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell of a man, stripped bare of all his deceptions and defenses. He had nothing left. He had lost his wife, his fabricated history, his righteous anger, and the respect of the only father he had ever known. He looked like a man who had finally, truly hit the bottom. He clearly believed there were no more secrets to reveal, no more lies to uncover. He was wrong. The document I now held in my hand was not about the past's betrayals, but about a choice I had made in the face of them. It was a choice that would redefine our entire relationship, not in the realm of emotion or memory, but in the cold, unassailable world of the law. From my inner coat pocket, I withdrew the final piece of my arsenal. It wasn't a brittle, yellowed letter or a faded lab report. It was a crisp, official document, bound in a heavy blue legal folder. I opened it and laid it on the table in front of him, next to his wife's abandoned diamond ring. The document was an official, court-stamped decree of adoption. The date on it was from 28 years ago, almost a full year after I had received the results of the DNA test. I remembered that day with perfect clarity. The sterile, wood-paneled courtroom, the bored-looking judge, the feeling of my own hand, steady and sure, as I signed my name on the final line. It was the day I had legally, officially, and irrevocably made Preston my son. It was a quiet, solitary act, a private declaration of love and commitment in the face of my wife's devastating betrayal. I had never told a soul. After I learned the truth, I began, my voice quiet but clear in the silent room. I had a choice to make. I could have exposed Lillian's affair, or I could have sent you away. By the laws of man and nature, I owed you nothing. You were another man's child. Preston stared at the adoption decree, his eyes tracing the legal jargon, his mind struggling to process this final, impossible revelation. He was seeing his own name, his own date of birth, and my name, listed under the heading of father. But I didn't do any of those things, I continued. I chose you. I chose to stay. So I went to a courthouse and filed these papers. It was a legal move to protect you, to sever any future claim Vaughn or his family might ever try to make. It was to ensure that my rights as your father were absolute, no matter what secrets came out. I tapped the paper with my finger. You were never my blood, Preston. But from that day forward, you were always, legally, my son. The concept seemed to short-circuit his brain. He had spent the evening grappling with the fact that I was not his biological father. Now he had to contend with the fact that I was, in every other way that mattered, his legal and chosen one. The narrative of his life had been rewritten so many times in the past few hours that he no longer had any ground to stand on. He was a man without a story, a collection of broken pieces. But the story of Vaughn, his biological father, was not yet complete. Vaughn knew about this, I said, gesturing to the adoption papers. He knew everything. I then produced the final item from that night's collection, a personal letter from Vaughn that had accompanied the legal documents concerning his will. It was not a formal, typed document, but a handwritten note on his personal stationery. The handwriting was shaky, the script of a man whose body was failing him, but the words were clear and strong. I read a part of it aloud, my voice echoing slightly in the grand, empty room. I have followed your life from a distance, Vaughn had written, addressing me directly. I saw the man you grew up to be, Preston. I saw your success, and I saw the 30 years of silence between you and the man who raised you. I know you believed he had wronged your mother, but you were mistaken. The fault was mine, and hers. I was a coward. I loved your mother, but I was not brave enough to claim my own son, to give you the life you deserved. He was. He did the hard work. He endured the betrayal and the heartache, and he raised my boy when I was too weak and selfish to do so myself. Vaughn's words were a confession and a final, clear-eyed assessment of his own failings. He had been a ghost in our lives, a silent observer who understood the truth of the situation far better than his own son ever had. The letter's final paragraph was the one that truly mattered, the one that recontextualized the entire reason Preston had returned to my life. I let Preston take the letter and read it for himself. "The money I am leaving is not an inheritance for my son," Vaughn had written. "Preston has made his own fortune, and he has made his choices. This money is a debt. It is a payment to you, the man who was a father when I was not. It is a small token of my gratitude for the love you gave my child, a love he did not know how to return. The money is yours. Do with it what you will. You have earned it." The $5 million was never meant for Preston. It was a gift from one man to another, a recognition of a debt that could never truly be repaid. It was Vaughn's final act, an attempt to honor the man who had done the job he had abdicated. The fortune Preston had come to claim was never his to begin with. Now it was my turn for the final reveal, the ultimate reckoning, the culmination of 30 years of silence and planning. I looked at the broken man before me, a man who had orchestrated this entire pathetic reunion for the sole purpose of claiming a fortune he now knew was not his. "So, here's what's going to happen, Preston," I said, my voice cold and hard, the voice of a man setting the final terms of surrender. "I am keeping Vaughn's $5 million. I am accepting his gift, his apology, and I will use it as I see fit. It is my money, and you will not see a single cent of it." I let that sink in. I watched the last flicker of hope die in his eyes, the hope that he could still somehow manipulate or guilt me into sharing the windfall. That hope was now extinguished, but I wasn't finished. The $5 million was a footnote. The real blow was yet to come. "But the other money," I continued, my tone shifting from hard to almost casual. "The $28 million from the lottery that you saw in the paper. The real reason you called me after 30 years. Oh, that's long gone." A flicker of confusion crossed his face, a desperate last-ditch attempt to find some angle. "What do you mean, gone?" he stammered. "You just won it 2 weeks ago." "That's right," I said. "And a week ago, I signed it all away. My lawyer simply executed an irrevocable trust we had designed years ago, a charitable plan Lillian always wanted for underprivileged children. The paperwork was ready. It only took a few days to process. It is an educational fund now. It will pay for their schooling, their books, their futures." I paused, letting the full weight of my next words land with maximum impact. "I even named it in your honor. It's called the Preston Fund." The irony was so thick, so perfect, it was almost poetic. His name, the name of the son who had abandoned me for money, would now be forever attached to an act of pure charity, a legacy of giving away a fortune he would never touch. The finality of it all seemed to crush him. He had come here tonight as a predator, a hunter stalking his prey, confident in his superiority. Now he was the one who had been thoroughly and completely outmaneuvered. He had been stripped of his lies, his money, his wife, and his self-respect. He had lost everything. He had entered this house as a king, and he was now a beggar in his own kingdom. It was at this moment that the front door opened again. It wasn't the sound of a servant or a caterer. It was the sound of Celeste's key in the lock. She had returned, but not for a reconciliation. She walked back into the dining room, her face set and resolute. She was no longer wearing the elegant cashmere dress she had worn for dinner. She had changed into a simple pair of jeans and a sweater. She was carrying a small overnight bag. The main event, the final public confrontation, was about to begin. She ignored me completely. Her focus was entirely on her husband, who was still slumped in his chair, a statue of defeat. "I went to the car to call my sister," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And then I realized I couldn't leave without doing this properly." She looked at Preston, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something that looked like pity in her eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by a wave of righteous anger. 30 years, she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a shout in the silent room. 30 years you could have had a father who loved you, a man who legally adopted you even after he knew you weren't his, a man who chose you, and you threw it all away. You chose your foolish pride, and you chose a lie. She took a step closer, her voice rising slightly. And tonight, you didn't choose to fix it. You didn't come back for him. You came back for greed. You were willing to lie to me, to him, to everyone, just to get your hands on more money. Money you already have plenty of. Money that wasn't even yours to begin with. She gestured around the vast, empty room, at the expensive art, the designer furniture, the life he had built. "You have all of this," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "And it has made you rotten to the core. I came back to return this in front of you." She took off the diamond ring. "So there is no doubt about what we are now." She didn't place it on the table this time. She threw it. It skittered across the polished wood, coming to a stop near his hand. "My lawyer will be in touch," she said, then turned and walked out for the last time. The sound of the front door closing for the second time that night was a sound of absolute, irrevocable finality. He sat there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the distant wail of a siren in the cold Christmas Eve air. He looked at the table in front of him, at the scattered remnants of his life, his mother's diary, his biological father's will, the adoption papers that bound him to a man he had rejected, and the diamond ring that represented a marriage he had just lost. He reached out a trembling hand, not for any of the documents, but for the heavy, ornate silver fork that lay beside his dessert plate. He picked it up, his grip unsteady. He stared at it, his knuckles white. And then, as if the weight of his losses was simply too much for his nerves to bear, his hand went slack. The fork slipped from his grasp. It fell, not with a loud crash, but with a series of small, distinct and terrible sounds. A soft clink as it hit the china plate, a sharp crack as it fractured the delicate porcelain, and a final rattling clatter as it came to rest. The sound of his entire world shattering. He finally looked at me, his eyes wide and empty, the eyes of a lost child. "Dad," he whispered, the word a raw, desperate plea. "Dad, please." It was the first time he had used that word with any sincerity all night, but it was 30 years too late. I looked down at him, at the man who was my son in the eyes of the law, but a stranger to my heart, and I felt nothing but a cold, empty calm. The time for anger was long past. The time for grief was over. This was simply the end of the story. "Don't," I said, my voice quiet, but it cut through his plea like a knife. "You have not earned that word back." I turned and walked away, leaving him there, amidst the ruins of his life. I didn't look back. I walked out of the massive front door into the cold, clear night. I left my son sitting alone in his mansion on Christmas Eve, a man who was rich in all the things that could be bought and utterly, completely bankrupt in everything that truly mattered. A year passed. The sharp, jagged edges of that Christmas Eve confrontation slowly softened into a dull, persistent ache. The anger faded, leaving behind a quiet, hollow space. I used Vaughn's money not on myself, but to purchase and renovate a derelict community building in my neighborhood. I turned it into a warm, brightly lit center for elderly people who, like me, had been left behind by their families. It's a place filled with the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of laughter, the cheerful clatter of checkers, and the rustle of newspaper pages turning. We have card games and book clubs, and a small garden out back where we grow tomatoes that are far too small but taste like victory. It is a house built not on secrets and lies, but on the simple, sturdy foundation of shared loneliness. It's a place where people who have been discarded can find a purpose again. I have found my purpose here, among the forgotten. Preston began to write. The first letter arrived about a month after that night, a single, handwritten page on plain white paper. There was no corporate letterhead, no secretary's impeccable typing, just his own unfamiliar scrawl. It was a clumsy, rambling apology, full of the kind of raw, unfiltered remorse that couldn't be faked. I read it, and then I put it away in a drawer. Another letter arrived the next month, and the month after that. They became a quiet rhythm in my new life. He never asked for anything. He simply chronicled the dismantling of his old world and the slow, painful construction of a new one. His divorce from Celeste was finalized in the spring. He sold his company in the summer, taking a fraction of what it was once worth. He sold the mansion in Westchester in the fall. The last letter I received told me he was living in a small, rented apartment and was volunteering at a nursing home. He was trying, in his own broken way, to earn back the word Dad. This afternoon, I sit in my office at the center, the latest letter unopened on my desk. Through the glass, I can see a woman I know named Eleanor being visited by her daughter. A rare and beautiful sight. They are holding hands, their faces close together as they talk, rebuilding a bridge that had been broken for years. I pull out the old blue legal folder from my desk drawer, the one containing the adoption papers. I look at Preston's name typed next to mine. Blood didn't make him my son. My choice did. And choices, I've come to realize, can be remade. His 30 years of silence were a choice. My 30 years of waiting were a choice. And now, another choice sits before me, contained in a simple, unopened envelope. I pick up a pen, the first time in a year I have considered a reply. Some reconciliations take 30 years to break. Others, I suppose, can take a lifetime to rebuild. I watch Eleanor and her daughter say their goodbyes. A long, heartfelt hug that speaks of forgiveness. I look at the community I have built. A family forged not from blood, but from the quiet understanding of shared pain and the stubborn hope for a better tomorrow. The old saying has it all wrong. Blood may be thicker than water, but love, I think, is the real kind. The kind that chooses to stay, the kind that shows up. Love is thicker than blood. Preston learned the hard way that fathers aren't made by biology or by money, but by showing up when it doesn't benefit you. The $28 million built something real and lasting for hundreds of children. Vaughn's $5 million? That's helping my son earn back his own name. One day of quiet, anonymous service at a time. Because the only inheritance that truly matters in the end is the chance to mean things right. Would you forgive a child who only returned for money? Or would you make them earn their way back into your life? Sometimes the greatest gift is a second chance, but only if they are willing to do the work to deserve it. Let me know what you think, and thank you for following our story.